Praise be to Jesus Christ in all things. Joining us right now via in-studio appearance, which is very rare for Catholic Drive Time. Pull that mic nice and close to you, Brent. Brent Haynes, he's an attorney. He's a Catholic public speaker, speaks often on religious liberty issues. He's also a political analyst, and we're grateful to have you back in the studio. Brent, good morning to you.
Good morning, Joe.
Praise be to God. Kyle Rittenhouse is, and this is just one of kind of a few really big trials going on in America right now, but the Kyle Rittenhouse trial being live streamed, it's been a very intense week with this particular trial. We've seen things that most of us lay knuckle draggers don't normally see when it comes to trials. You know, the judges berating prosecutors, things like that. The defendant taking the stand. I didn't go to law school. I did stay at a Holiday Inn once, but I was under the impression, according to Law and Order on television, you don't ever put your defendant on the stand, right? That's a rule. Why did he do that?
Well, and Law and Order, of course, is the standard for legal knowledge in the United States.
Why go to law school?
Because everybody has seen it. That's right. That's right. I wasted 3 years of my life going to law school. I could have just watched more Law and Order.
That's what I'm saying.
It is unusual for defendants, especially in murder cases, to take the stand. And as one commentator said, this is the most concise way to explain it. The defendant could say maybe just one thing that's wrong, and the jury focuses on that, despite all the other evidence.
It's risky.
It's very risky, and the defendant is always going to be examined by an experienced prosecutor. They don't let brand new prosecutors try murder cases. So you have an expert asking questions, someone who is trained and someone who's been doing it for years, asking a defendant who is usually not an expert in communication. And we saw that here with Kyle Rittenhouse. It was unusual for him to take the stand, not just because it's unusual in general for murder defendants, but also because in this case, the general consensus was, and most Americans could see this for themselves by looking at all the videotape evidence that's available to all of us. It was unusual in this case because Kyle Rittenhouse's defense seemed to be going so well. And putting him on the stand seemed to add an unnecessary risk. Mm-hmm. Now, at some point, probably these defense lawyers will hold a press conference or write a book or go on interviews, and they'll explain, why they put him on the witness stand. But one reasonable inference is that they wanted to humanize their client so that he wouldn't just be sitting there as this, young person who'd gone around parading around with a gun, an assault rifle, underage, and ended up shooting and killing 3 people. Maybe they wanted to humanize him in front of the jury.
Well, Grosskreutz, he testified before Kyle went on the stand. And under examination, he actually said Kyle had not threatened him. He had pointed his gun and threatened to kill him when Kyle raised his weapon and shot him.
I think the
defendant's attorney actually called for a directed verdict right after that.
Well, and that really gets to one of the problems with this case. Look, there are several charges against Kyle Rittenhouse. The charge involving Grosskreutz is just, it's a legal abomination. I mean, this is a violation of ethics. These prosecutors should be sanctioned at the very least, and the elected district attorney for Kenosha County is responsible for this. If someone points a firearm at you and then you shoot them, that is self-defense. The person who points the firearm at you in most jurisdictions is going to be charged with a felony. In some jurisdictions, it's going to be assault with a deadly weapon. They don't necessarily have to discharge the weapon. They don't have to shoot you or shoot at you. Just pointing the gun at you in a menacing manner, especially in the context of what Grosskreutz did, that itself was a crime. It was Grosskreutz who should have been charged. But instead, the prosecutors actually invoked the legal machinery of the criminal justice system of Wisconsin to put Kyle Rittenhouse on trial for that charge. That's simply unethical. Now, the other charge with the second man who was killed, he had attacked Rittenhouse and hit him with the skateboard in the head or the neck. And we've all seen the video. There's the other man there almost simultaneously who's been described as, jump kick man. Yeah. You can see the pictures of him kicking or attempting to kick Kyle Rittenhouse in the face and head. That's clearly a self-defense situation. If the prosecutors wanted to bring charges that Kyle Rittenhouse shot the man with the skateboard, and the skateboard is not a deadly weapon, you can argue that it was at least plausible to bring those charges and to let a jury decide. But in the case of Grosskreutz, they had the video. They knew what happened. They knew that Grosskreutz was the one who pointed his weapon at Kyle Rittenhouse first. So that Grosskreutz charge really shows you how off the track these prosecutors are, just not just professionally but ethically.
So the defense attorneys called for a directed verdict right after that because it was and the look on one of the prosecutors, the face palms, his head is down and he just looks. Who knows what he was actually thinking? He could have been thinking about, I got to pay my gas bill or something. I mean, who knows? But it looked really bad from an optics standpoint. And then the defense attorneys call for a directed verdict. Tell us, what's a directed verdict and why didn't the judge grant that?
A directed verdict is where the judge tells the jury how to decide the issue. He directs them.
It doesn't go to jury at that point.
It goes to the jury, but the judge tells them you have to find it this way.
This is how it's going to go down.
You're going to go back there and you're going to check this box.
So why didn't he grant that?
Well, probably for the same reason he won't grant the mistrial with prejudice.
Okay.
Judges in general like to have issues decided by jury.
All right, hold that thought. That music means we're going to go to a short break. We're going to come right back. Brent, before the break, you were talking about, I was asking about the directed verdict and why the judge would not have granted the directed verdict. I mean, they've since asked for a mistrial, but the directed verdict came out first, like right away. I mean, and commentators are going ballistic watching the live video feed for that. So you were saying before the break.
There are different ways a judge can decide a case without it going to the jury. And one way is simply, for example, to declare a mistrial. In Wisconsin, what the defendants asked for was a mistrial with prejudice. And what that means is the judge declares this trial is over, it's not going to continue. And with prejudice, this is the key part, it means the state cannot try that defendant again on those charges. That's why the prejudice part is very important. A judge could also do what's called a directed verdict and tell the jury, and there will be, of course, legal language that would go into this, but he essentially tells the jury that they have to decide the case a certain way. Now, there are multiple charges in this case, so even if there's a directed verdict on one of the criminal charges, doesn't mean there's a directed verdict on all of them.
It wouldn't have ended the deal.
Correct. Completely. But the bigger point is that judges generally don't like to take cases away from juries. There's several good reasons for this. From the judge's point of view, if the jury goes back and decides the case, in this situation, for example, the jury goes back and decides in Kyle Rittenhouse's favor anyway, then it's all over. The jury, as the voice of the community, has represented the community. They have spoken. The case is done. But if the judge makes certain legal rulings and prevents the jury from hearing the case, then possibly he gets overturned on appeal. Maybe, and it could depend, of course, on the specifics of Wisconsin law and what constitutes prejudice and what doesn't. But in general, judges like to have juries decide issues. Now, another point is the judge can always set aside the verdict after it comes back. That can happen, and sometimes judges do that. Sometimes they send it to the jury. They hope the jury gets what they think is the right decision.
Does that mean, like, if they come back and they say and they give something that the judge thinks is outrageous, he can just say, "Hey, we're not sorry. I'm overturning that."
Essentially, yes.
So can we get into some of the shenanigans that were going down between the prosecutor and the judge? I mean, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, when it comes to prosecutors, you don't give this to rookies. These are seasoned veterans, right?
This prosecutor, the lead prosecutor here is a very good lawyer. I haven't watched all 8 days. I have to work for a living, but I have watched enough, some of it live and some of it, on the replay. This prosecutor is a very good prosecutor. He knows what he is doing, and that is why the errors he has made are not by accident. They're not innocent. They're not negligence. As the defense lawyer said at one point, he's an experienced lawyer, and the defense lawyer said he knows better. The judge has gotten a lot of attention and even criticism. And he sounds like he's a pretty.
What were the shenanigans that the prosecutor was trying?
There are two important ones we could discuss briefly.
Yeah.
One is on the prosecution wanted to bring up certain evidence and ask Kyle Rittenhouse about it. Mm-hmm. Now, in almost every trial, there's evidence that each side doesn't want the other side to be able to use. And sometimes this evidence is so inflammatory or prejudicial that the lawyer for one side, in this case, Kyle Rittenhouse's lawyers, they don't even want that issue mentioned in front of the jury.
Right.
And this is called a motion in limine in most
because once they hear, how can they unhear?
That's exactly the rationale. Once they hear it, they can't unhear it, even though judges will frequently give instructions you're supposed to disregard that. You know it's really there in their heads.
Yeah.
So lawyers will file what's called a motion in limine, and it might have another name in a jurisdiction. It might have a different name in Wisconsin. But the idea is it's a motion to limit the evidence until the trial proceeds. And when the trial reaches an appropriate point where one lawyer wants to use evidence that is subject to this limitation, they're not supposed to do that in front of the jury until they ask the judge. And they ask the judge outside the presence of the jury. And at that point, they look at all the evidence that has come in. You'll hear a phrase, and it happened in this case too, opening the door. So the prosecution wanted to bring in evidence that Kyle Rittenhouse had previously said that he wished he had his gun to stop some looters. The prosecutors wanted to do that because he wanted to show that that was Kyle Rittenhouse's mindset, that, he was up there willing to use deadly force to protect property. And that's obviously a sensitive issue.
Let's just say he was previously willing to use deadly force. But does that mean that factor is a factor in the events of that night?
Well, the prosecution will want to show that that's his mindset, and the defense obviously doesn't want to have to address that argument, and that's why you have trained professionals on each side going to the judge and making legal arguments as to why it should or should not come in. Now, what happened in the Rittenhouse trial, and the reason the judge got furious, and for very good reason, and I watched this twice, because the prosecutors, not only his actions, but his attitude seemed to me disrespectful or rather nonchalant. What happened was the prosecutor got to that part of his cross-examination of Kyle Rittenhouse, and he started to go into that evidence, and he had not asked the judge for permission. And that's why the judge sent the jury out of the courtroom and then yelled at the prosecutor, because the prosecutor violated or essentially violated what he knew was a court order. And this is a standard procedure in virtually every trial in the United States. Every lawyer who's been in a courtroom and tried even one case or taken even basic training in how to conduct trials knows that you do not do this. And so there's good reason the judge was mad at him. And that's just on that one issue. Now, on the other issue, it's much more serious because it gets into a constitutional right. Everybody in America, because we watch Law and Order, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Everybody in America knows that criminal defendants have what? The right to remain silent. And what happened is the Rittenhouse prosecutor, again, when he's cross-examining Kyle Rittenhouse, he was making the point where you're telling your story now, but you've listened to all these witnesses here, and you've done this and you've done that, and you've read the internet. And what he was getting at is he was trying to, as he told the judge, he's trying to show, well, the defendant has been able to sit here this entire time and for the last year read everything, watch everything, and then sit through this trial, and now he can tailor his testimony to fit what he thinks he needs to say to be acquitted. That's the prosecutor's idea. The only problem with that is it implicates the defendant's right to remain silent after arrest. Yeah. Because that would apply to every single defendant in the United States.
Irregardless.
Regardless. Doesn't matter whether it's Kyle Rittenhouse or anybody else. It's a slightly subtle point because the prosecutor was being a little tricky. He was sort of going at it from a different direction. But when he was saying that about Kyle Rittenhouse, what he was implying was, you didn't talk about the case until now. Prosecutors are absolutely forbidden to go anywhere near a defendant's invocation of his right to remain silent. And the judge, again, although perhaps he shouldn't have raised his voice as much, perhaps he shouldn't raise his voice as frequently as he does.
Well, depends on your perspective.
Right, exactly. Maybe he should have done it more.
The judge was absolutely right to admonish that prosecutor. He is an experienced prosecutor. Yeah. As the defense said, he knows better. And, at a minimum, that prosecutor should be sanctioned. You combine that with the fact that they brought the murder charge regarding Grosskreutz, even though Grosskreutz was the one who first pointed his weapon at Kyle Rittenhouse.
Adrian?
We have about 2 minutes left in the conversation, and I just want to go through real quick, shifting points just slightly. In regards to the prosecutor, we've heard tons of people come out saying a lot of different things about this prosecutor, saying, oh, he's incompetent, he's a horrible lawyer, or two, oh, maybe he's actually on Rittenhouse's side, he's trying to get the trial thrown out, so that's why he's doing such a horrible job. And in reality, why does it seem to people watching that he's doing a horrible job, and what's actually going on with the prosecutor there?
Well, and if anybody out there thinks he's doing a horrible job, it's because he's doing things he shouldn't be doing. But he's not a bad attorney. If you watch his full cross-examination of Kyle Rittenhouse, he's making very good points, and he did some damage. He was able to take advantage. We talked at the beginning of this segment about how a defendant is not trained in communication usually. Lawyers are. This lawyer is very good, and he got several admissions from Rittenhouse to try to chip away at his credibility. But it's not an issue of him not being an experienced lawyer.
But do you think he's trying to throw the trial so that he can reset and try again better next time?
That's what the defense claimed. I wouldn't look. We don't know what's really in his mind.
Right.
But if you just think about it from his perspective, if he thinks he's going to lose the case anyway, then there's nowhere to go but up. If he tries to get the evidence in, it slips past the judge, there's no objection, the jury hears it, maybe they vote his way, or if the judge declares a mistrial, maybe he gets to try the defendant again.
But if the judge declares a directed verdict, then he's in trouble here.
Well, if the judge declares a directed verdict, or if the jury goes against him, it's all over.
But not only that, but he has to live with this reputation now as a prosecutor, doesn't he?
Yes.
Isn't that one of the biggest impacts on his personal his person is going to be that every commentator is going to be bashing him now as the guy who lost the Rittenhouse trial because he tried to do things he wasn't supposed to be doing.
Well, as you know, in America, we have an attention span of about 30 seconds.
I'm sorry, what were you saying?
Yes.
You're going to have to hold that thought. We're out of time. But you tell you what, though, Brent, if you have time and you can hang out, you're welcome to stay around and in the after show, which is the second half of the next hour. So going back to the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, this morning I read a report. Many outlets reported it. I read the Breitbart version of the journalist who was there documenting things, and in his testimony, I would say, is pretty convincing about the motivation and intentions of Kyle Rittenhouse, not wanting to attack, trying to be a help, and only firing when attacked, trying to de-escalate. It's pretty. I would say it's pretty convincing. But you're an attorney. What say you?
He was definitely trying to help Kyle Rittenhouse. Now, of course, from everything we've seen, everything he said is accurate. He was there documenting the events with video. That was his purpose in being there, so that he could then go and comment on it. But your description of his testimony at the beginning of the previous hour was right on. He described how the agitators the demonstrators had been proceeding down the street, and then they stopped at the car lot because they saw some of the people, Rittenhouse and others, on the roof with their long guns. And that's where he said Rittenhouse actually went up to them and tried to de-escalate. Now, the prosecutor asked if he could hear them. He said no, he couldn't hear them, but he gestured with his hands, palms out, gesturing down, and sort of the universal calm down signal. And Drew Hernandez said it worked. He said, the crowd moved on. So that was significant because it showed that Kyle Rittenhouse wasn't out there looking for trouble, that he wasn't out there taking every opportunity to get into a fight. He actually was trying to de-escalate. he described a lot of Rosenbaum's
Emily is a friend of mine.
I'm sorry about that. I was trying to switch, and I accidentally hit the button. My apologies. Go on.
He described a lot of what Rosenbaum did. It doesn't play directly into the events where the shootings occurred, but there was a lot of activity, and Rosenbaum was on camera. There was a lot of activity down at a gas station, and I believe it was Rosenbaum, they had set fire to a dumpster.
Yeah.
And, maybe it's just me, but starting fires near gas stations seems like a pretty dangerous activity.
I don't know where you're coming up with that, Brent. It seems
yeah, he
logical.
Also, Hernandez also testified that Rosenbaum used the N-word, that, Rosenbaum was saying, shoot me.
Hadn't he just been released?
There were news reports that he had just been released from a psychiatric hospital that day.
That day?
That's what one report said. It's also now come out that he was a horrific child pedophile rapist.
Holy smokes.
So,
and that's why he was being evaluated in a psychiatric hospital?
Well, apparently he'd been evaluated because he had threatened to kill himself. This is a man who needed care and treatment, who clearly had something wrong with him.
Why was he released? I didn't read this report, so I don't know. Do you happen to know?
Well, I don't know, but I can tell you, the legal standard for keeping someone against their will because of mental health is they have to be a danger to themselves or others.
Like the children he was attacking.
Well, those children are back in Arizona.
Oh, man.
In order to keep anybody against their will, you have to show that they're a danger to themselves or others, and the doctors there presumably concluded that the suicide threat had passed.
So
but he clearly was a disturbed person.
Yeah, clearly.
And this is the killing Rosenbaum is the strongest case the prosecutors have because Rosenbaum didn't have a weapon. Grosskreutz is the one who should have been charged with the crime there because he was the one who first he approached Rittenhouse while Rittenhouse was down on the ground. He approached him even after Rittenhouse had fired on someone else. Instead of just leaving, Grosskreutz approached him and pointed his handgun at him. Grosskreutz is not a sworn peace officer. He's not a police officer. He's not a sheriff's deputy. He's not a United States Marshal. He's not an FBI agent. He is, however, he admitted, has an affiliation with a Marxist militia group, the People's Revolution.
Oh, wow.
So Grosskreutz is the true vigilante in that situation. Kyle Rittenhouse never should have been charged with Grosskreutz's injury because Grosskreutz pointed his gun at Kyle Rittenhouse, and Grosskreutz admitted that, but that was also visible in videotape, and that's why it was wrong for the prosecutors to bring that case. On Rosenbaum, who was the first one who was shot, there's no good video of that event. It all comes down to the testimony, although there's some distant video that picks up audio. But Rosenbaum didn't have a deadly weapon on him, as it turns out. So you can see why, in a situation like that, maybe prosecutors would say, look, the fair thing here is to put this to a jury and let a jury decide.
Yeah. Now, just made me think about it. You said there was no great video of that. Yet we discovered in the process of this trial that the FBI had drone footage.
The FBI has a lot of drone footage.
College U.S. Who knew that the FBI was running drones above our cities at this time?
They're not the only ones, Joe.
What?
I mean, and I guess from some of the commentary that I looked at, and I didn't look too deep into this, just so you know, they made an argument that said, well, our job isn't to get involved in these local affairs.
Only school boards, Joe.
Only school board. Oh, okay. My bad. I'm writing that down. FBI, only
school boards. When it comes to local issues, only school boards.
Yeah, gotcha. But that's rather bizarre, don't you think, that they're going to fly drones above our cities during the riots and then not take any action to do anything?
Well, we could have an entire program on the activities of the FBI.
Could we now? Maybe we should book a show.
Only a few days ago, they raided the home and offices of reporters of Project Veritas.
I reported on that, yeah. They cuffed him, by the way.
So we have a comment from Bill Collins. Get your take on it. He said, Kyle appeared to be well-intentioned, but was his full frontal cortex really developed enough to be there with the weapon? I have 6 kids. I ask myself, would I want my child to be there with the weapon? Then he goes on and says, I agree on the Rosenbaum being the strongest case for the prosecution, but he did attempt to grab the rifle. Many police have shot when people have tried to get their guns, and legitimately so.
Yeah.
So your take?
Well, first of all, I'm not.
That's one of the main issues is why is an underage young man armed with an AR-15 at this event? And that's one of the questions at stake in this trial.
Well, that's not supposed to be the issue. The issue should be, was he justified in defending himself with deadly force?
Yeah, but isn't that what one of the angles the prosecutor was going after in his cross-examination?
Well, anytime a lawyer's in court, and it doesn't matter what kind of case it is, they want to put the specific issue in the context of a larger story and a narrative, try to get everything across, to the jury. And to back up for just a moment, I am not saying that Rittenhouse was not justified in shooting Mr. Rosenbaum. What I'm saying is I understand why the prosecutors might say, look, we really need to have this case decided by a jury, and I'm using that to contrast that with the decision to charge Rittenhouse on the Grosskreutz shooting, because that's completely different. I mean, Grosskreutz had a handgun. He aimed it at Rittenhouse.
Yeah, it's different.
And it's Grosskreutz who should have been charged. What I'm saying is Rosenbaum, for all of his behavior, and I think Rittenhouse was justified in shooting him. What I'm saying is you can understand where, and there's no good video, there's no direct video on that.
Yeah.
So you can understand where the prosecutors would say, let's put that to a jury. Now, this issue of 17-year-old going around with a rifle and being in situations like that, that raises a question for me that I've wondered about from the beginning. We haven't heard anything, I haven't heard much about him, is where was his father, and what's the father's role in his upbringing? And we as Catholics understand why families are so important.
Oh, look at the gang beating of a 60-some-odd-year-old man in New York City.
And it's every day. So Kyle Rittenhouse strikes me as a well-intentioned young man, a good-natured young man. I think he's also been shown to be somewhat of an embellisher. A lot of people
he's
are.
immature.
Yes, especially when you're a teenager. Whether it's resume padding or making exaggerations on Facebook or Instagram or whatever the forum is.
Yeah.
And that's something also that the prosecution used against him. They were able to say that he lied, claiming he was an EMT. And the prosecution made a point that you lied even when you were being interviewed, because he lied to the media because he was being interviewed. He said, yes, I'm an EMT. And that goes back to Adrian's question at the end of the radio broadcast where, is the prosecutor really incompetent or is he doing these things on purpose? No, the prosecutor's very good. He got some of those admissions out of Rittenhouse. But this issue of him running around with a gun, look, I support Second Amendment rights, and he'll probably get convicted on the possession of a dangerous weapon because he's 17 years old and he had it.
But that's a much lesser charge.
Much lesser. They are not worried about that.
Yeah.
The only thing that I read that's 9 months in jail at the most.
Oh wow, he could still go to jail over that.
He could. Now, most people in most jurisdictions for something like that would,
Now
get probation.
Wait, so I thought, maybe you can correct me here, because my understanding was he didn't violate any laws in regards to carrying a weapon because he didn't cross state borders with it because it was someone else's gun in the state that he was coming into, and it was and he did. I thought he did have permission to have that gun.
Well, he testified that he had paid for it, that he kept it with his friend. It's true. A lot of the hysterical media keep using this phrase. He crossed state lines. He crossed state lines. Well, go look at the map. His family lives there in Kenosha. His father, grandmother, I think cousins. He apparently had worked a job in Kenosha that day as a lifeguard or something.
So it's practically his residency.
It's home for him.
It's not the same as when Antifa was going by busloads into new cities like the one right here we live in Houston, Texas, showing up, having pallets of bricks delivered downtown in hopes of fostering a riot, threatening Annunciation Catholic Church to burn it down to the face of the pastor, which is why Adrian and I and other men had to go stand guard over that parish during that time.
Right, but the other thing is, though, even if he had crossed state lines, why, even if that, I don't understand the line of argumentation, because, for instance, if I was, I don't know, in Louisiana, and someone said, "Hey, someone's gonna attack my church at Annunciation," and I'd be like, "Hey, I have friends and family over there," or I just want to be a good person. Like, "Hey, I'm gonna go over there and stand guard outside Annunciation just to be a good citizen." Would that be? Why would that be? Is that criminal? Is that wrong?
The crossing state lines is significant if someone is involved in a crime. Because it can give the FBI jurisdiction, or it can give the federal government jurisdiction.
Well, the other issue too is, I mean, every state has their own laws in regards to weapons.
Yes, and firearms. this whole issue of him crossing state lines, this is just a talking point by the hysterical commentators and media who are trying to turn this entire tragic situation into something it's not. The president, when he was still the candidate, sent out a tweet with a picture of Kyle Rittenhouse holding his rifle, criticizing Donald Trump for, quote, not condemning white supremacy.
Yeah, so that's mind-numbing, because that was bigger than just that, too. There were people who are gun advocates on the right who came out against Kyle Rittenhouse.
Well, look, Kyle Rittenhouse, this goes back to the issue of why is a 17-year-old going around with an AR-15, his maturity level, all of that was a volatile situation. Another question I've always had since this all started is, if you are up there defending property, one thing you do in a situation like that is you make sure you stay with your group. You don't allow yourself to get separated. You don't allow yourself to get separated. That goes back to the maturity issue and people who advocate for gun rights. We don't want to lose our gun rights because of the irresponsible actions of others.
Well, just in a defense of Kyle right there, I mean, I think it shows a lot of, if I, for some reason, decided that I wanted to do something like that, I don't know if I would have had the foresight to be like, okay, I have a gun in the other state. I'm going to travel across. I'm going to make sure I have my gun with me, have the discipline and the training enough to be able to use it only in the circumstance where he did use it, and he was going over,
or the medical kit,
he had on, the people he was helping. It didn't seem to me that he was being immature. I mean, you might argue. It's like if someone is 40 years old and did the same thing, I don't know if they would have done anything better if they were 40 years old. I think he was showing a lot of maturity. You might argue that nobody should be doing what he did, and that it's just a wrong thing to do. But I don't think it's a question of maturity.
I think the argument may be more of the potential for greater danger because of the immaturity potential. I think it's more of a potential argument than it is in the actual behavior that night.
I mean, because people his age can go to war.
Although I have to agree strongly, Kyle had no business out walking by himself.
Well, to go back to Adrian, that was very well put. I think in those instances,
you shouldn't say that to him.
Once he gets,
we can't say these things publicly.
Well, once Rittenhouse gets in those situations, what are you going to do? And
he had the foresight not to point his gun at people until he had no choice but to shoot.
Right, and I don't know if I would have had that discipline.
I'm pretty impressed.
Yeah, and he seems like he knows what he's doing when it comes to handling firearms. He explained.
He even testified at one point that there was one person who was confronting him, and he didn't point. This was after one shot was fired. He still didn't point his gun at the person. I can't remember 100% the specifics, but if you go back and watch the testimony, you'll see it. And I think the attorney asks him, "Well, why didn't you point the gun?" Because he didn't pose a threat to my life. Like that's a lot of control and discipline right there. That demonstrates quite a bit.
Look, the reality is that most firearm owners are very responsible.
Right, 100%.
This is why the Alec Baldwin shooting situation, for example, illustrates the difference between.
Oh, are you familiar? Have you been watching that?
Look,
the rumor mill is so active right now on that issue.
I haven't heard the latest one. I saw that a lawsuit was filed yesterday.
Yes, the technician who held Helena Hutchins in her dying moments is suing Alec Baldwin, the armorer, and the assistant director. But there are claims out there, rumors, allegedly, that this was intended.
Well, whether it was intended or not, the point is, anybody who respects the Second Amendment and owns firearms, or is even familiar with it in terms of familiar with gun ownership, knows that Alec Baldwin and the person who handed him the gun, they both violated the fundamental rules of firearms. If I have a gun and I hand it to you, you know this, you were in the Marine Corps, but if I have a gun and I hand it to you and I say, don't worry, Joe, it's not loaded, who's responsible for that gun?
Me.
You are.
Yeah, 100%.
And Alec Baldwin was responsible.
I agree, totally. That was my comment that when that story broke, is the armor, the assistant director, that's all well and good. Now, some of the stories that are coming out with this technician's lawsuit is, part of his lawsuit was, well, Alec set the stage on the set by being a tyrant. And he didn't want to be bothered and messed with, and so everybody was walking on eggshells. So they didn't want to have to go through all the procedures to bother him, and so that sort of set the stage for this. But I don't care. Alec's hands on the gun.
That's right.
And you don't take a gun from someone else and not check it first. You know what I mean? Like, in fact, it's in the Marine Corps, when you're going through a general inspection, you're standing at attention and the DI or your commanding officer's walking down the line and he takes your weapon. What's the first thing he does?
Checks it.
Even in the formality of that, sort of that quasi-liturgy that happens in the military. Hold on. They check the weapon first.
Yeah. And you'll see that in videos. People, the kind of thing, they gloss over it, they don't realize it, but if you pay attention, you look, you always see the drill instructor or whoever it is, you see them.
And that's in a sort of like a ritual of kind.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's just the way it goes. Someone hands you a gun, you're responsible. You can't pull the trigger and blame someone else. You just can't.
That's exactly.
It's kind of funny though, because I know someone who is in Hollywood, and they were told, because they were just literally just like a grip, and they didn't do anything else, and they were making like no money at all. But they were asking someone on set of a movie, does anyone know how to shoot a firearm? Anyone know how to use a firearm? Nobody said they knew how to do it. So then they asked the entire. So this is California. This is California. So they asked the whole crew, does anyone know how to use a firearm? And he was like, I do. And he asked him about it. He goes, yeah, I own firearms. And everybody was like,
right. That was the last day he worked there, wasn't it?
No. So he actually ended up getting to be on screen because he was the only person that knew how to use a firearm.
No kidding.
And so that doesn't shock me. Like nobody in Hollywood.
Alec Baldwin's been on many movies with handguns in his hand.
Not to give him an excuse. I'm just saying, it's not surprising to me that people on set have no sense of how to handle firearms. No, they should, but they don't.
Look, it's just life in general. A friend of mine who has handled firearms during the riots last summer, she went and bought at least one additional firearm.
Yeah,
notice
gun sales were up by millions.
But here's the point of this story is, then she's telling me later, her husband doesn't share her convictions on all these issues, and her husband is a very well educated, very accomplished man, but he doesn't know anything about guns. And so she's telling me afterwards in horror. She's telling me, he picked up the gun and he's just like waving it around.
Oh my.
And she was rightly horrified.
Yeah.
People, and it's familiarity. Or in this case, it's lack of familiarity breeds contempt when it comes to guns. But getting back to the Rittenhouse case, when he was on the stand, the prosecution has been trying to argue that he was doing something with when he was laying on his back during the second and third shootings, or was down on the ground. The prosecution was trying to argue that he was doing something, and they were trying to say that he had, as they said, racked. The better word is charge.
Yeah.
But as he, that's where
it's this on the AR-15. There's the rack. You pull it back, and it brings the bolt back, and then you let it go, and it slams around into the chamber.
And if he had, and so Kyle Rittenhouse
makes a pretty distinct noise.
And Kyle Rittenhouse explained, well, if you do that, then the round that's in the chamber gets discharged, and then later. With one of the witnesses, one of the evidence witnesses, the defense established you didn't find any live rounds there.
Laying on the ground. And by discharge, we don't mean it came out the barrel. It comes out the chamber.
I'm sorry. Exactly.
It ejects it out of the chamber.
It ejects it. I shouldn't say discharge.
So it would be lying on the ground, and it would be an actual bullet with a cartridge with a round in it.
And there wouldn't have been anything wrong with if Rittenhouse had done that anyway. What he's already shot at least once in self-defense, and if he thinks his weapon is jammed, that's a standard procedure for clearing a jam.
Sure is.
Yeah. So he seems to know what he's doing. You're right.
Yeah, that's that point we made a minute ago. I am very impressed, actually, given the intensity of that situation. Being surrounded,
he could have been a lot
multiple
worse.
people trying to harm you. You don't know if they intend to kill you. They're trying to swing a skateboard at your head. They're trying to put a boot on your head. I mean, in the Marine Corps, when we did line training, we were trained to put your boot through the skull of your enemy. Like, that's what you do in that move. It's not to just, tag you and you're it. So even though they did that person didn't have a gun, that boot becomes a threatening life-threatening weapon.
You go back and you look.
The skateboard is a life-threatening weapon.
That exactly. You go back and you look at the videos of, especially from the riots from last summer. This phenomenon or this activity of people taking running head starts and jumping and doing flying kicks. This has become a frequent occurrence, and skateboards are heavy. They're heavy. It's like hitting somebody, say, with a bat or almost with a bat. These are serious threats, and of course that's what the jury's going to have to determine. But I agree with what Adrian said earlier. I mean, once you got into that situation, and I think you're making the same point, Joe. Rittenhouse. He could have lost it. He could have been immature. He could have just started shooting everybody anywhere around him, and he didn't.
Do you think? We only have a couple of minutes left before we have to say goodbye. I mean, if you were a betting man, how would you bet this trial ends? I mean, it's pure speculation. But
first of all, I think probably all the issues go to the jury. That the judge may take away the issue on Grosskreutz because Grosskreutz said on the witness stand.
Right.
He pointed the gun first.
Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play?
Exactly. The judge might actually take that issue away from the jury and say, "I'm directing you on this one."
Yeah.
It's hard. The problem is this trial's become politicized. The jurors have already been filmed. The judge told the jurors they've been filmed. The police are already preparing for riots if the jurors don't come out, if the jury doesn't come back with convictions. Yeah. So the sad thing is this can affect the jury process. If the jury follows the evidence, he's going to be acquitted on all of the serious murder charges. Oh, really? And sure. I mean, we've all seen it. The only one that doesn't have the direct video is with Rosenbaum, and there we have the evidence that he'd threatened to kill him earlier. He was charging him, and he had grabbed the weapon. And then maybe the jury finds him guilty, possibly of a lesser charge, but probably the jury finds him guilty on the firearms charge.
Wow. All right. Well, there you go. Praise be to God. Golly Jewish, guys, thanks for hanging out with us today. Thank you, Brent Haynes, for coming in, giving us some interesting conversation about the trial. And we'll have to see how it goes.